Ukraine was the only Soviet republic that had a referendum on independence.
Today is necessary to support Ukraine as much as possible.
Ukraine as a state nation is fully born really now in this warfare. The history of Ukraine is really at least 1,000 years long history. The origins are in Kiev, and that's where, if you travel to Kiev, you can see the buildings coming from the time, the era of the medieval period called Kievan Rus. There is a connection, of course, with history of Ukraine today and reality of Ukraine today, given that Kiev is the capital of Ukraine. And if you look at the Ukrainian coat of arms, it's a trident. Trident is a symbol of the Kievan princess. So there is a close connection in terms of history, territory, and also in terms of Ukrainian thinking about themselves and where they come from. There is one big issue for Ukrainians in particular, is that Russians in particular also consider Kiev to be origins of Russia. And if you look at most of the history books that have been written and published in the West, especially before 1991, they would not write about Kievan Rus, they would write about Kievan Russia. So the Kievan heritage was very much claimed by the Russian Empire. In the 18th century, in the 19th century, living Ukrainians with basically no rights for their own history, for their own territory, and for their own cultural heritage. And what is happening today, it's the war on many levels, but it is also the war of historical narratives. And this is an attempt on the part of Ukraine actually to defend not themselves, not only themselves, but also their history and these deep roots that are really there, visible. They're right there in Kiev, which was under siege, that was able to defend itself in this war. I mentioned that this claim for Kievan heritage, again, comes at the very beginning, it's the imperial period, it's even before Russia became an empire, because the claim that the Muscovite rulers, princes, they came from the same dynasty, from the Kievan dynasty, provided for them legitimization for the war against Novgorod, for example, for the war trying to take over other Rus principalities in the 15th and 16th century, in the war with the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. That was the argument. In the 19th century, you see a different turn in that story, and that turn is about the rise of the modern nations. And in the Russian Empire, the Poles were the first, with, of course, the Polish anthem about the Poland is still alive. Again, it was mirrored in the Ukrainian anthem after that. But the point was that the Polish state is gone in the 18th century. But Poland lives because we are alive. So it's a very different concept. It's a concept of a nation that can exist outside of the state or against the state. And that was the model that was adopted by Ukraine and Ukrainians. So this link between the two anthems, it's point also to a much more profound connection about thinking about yourself as being a nation without a state. Now, the Russian Empire recognizes the threat very early on. During the Second Polish Uprising in 1863, there is a official ban on publications in Ukrainian language. So it's an arrest to develop the formation of a modern Ukrainian nation that lasts for 40 years. So when I look today at what is happening, for example, in Bucha and in Irpin and in others, and you go also to the schools and you see the signs in Ukrainian being crossed out on the classrooms and things done in Russian, and this discourse about brotherhood and so on and so forth, when other brother or other sister has no right to have their own identity or even to live, for me it automatically goes back to 1863. Because this is the attempt to erase the nation as such, to arrest its development. And in that sense, again, there is a just direct connection between Imperial Russia of mid-19th century and the discourse that we are getting today in Mr. Putin's articles. Because when Mr. Putin says that Russians and Ukrainians are one and the same people, he doesn't mean that Russians are really Ukrainians. What he really means is that the Ukrainians are Russians, they don't have the right to exist. Whatever Ukrainian identity is, it's linked and comes to the Nazi and Nazification. So when he talks about denazification, he talks about actually wiping out all elements of a separate Ukrainian identity. De-Ukrainization, that's the term.
Thank you. I understand, and I fully agree with this analysis that it started in this period in the 19th century to stop development of modern nation. But Putin is using quite often such argument that everything, this territorial form of Ukraine, that is to some extent the gift of Soviet Union, etc. Could you tell us about this period of the history? Soviet Union and the politics from Moscow or Soviet Politburo vis-à-vis Ukraine?
What we see here is not just misuse of history, but abuse of history, in the sense that even some basic things like chronology of events is being sacrificed in the name of a particular argument and a particular vision of history. When we look at history itself, looking at just chronologically even, the formation of or declaration of the existence of Ukrainian state comes within 1 week after the Bolshevik takeover in Petrograd at that time, so after the Bolshevik Revolution. So the Central Rada that existed already in Kiev, starting from the spring of 1917, in October of 1917, declares that it's not any more autonomy of the Russian Federation or whatever is left out of the Russian Empire, that it is a separate state, but a state that is prepared to enter into the federal relationship with another state, which would be Russia. So 1 week after the Bolshevik takeover, the question is whether Lenin really created that state. Well, to the same degree as Charles III, the King of Britain, created the United States of America.
Good example.
And then what you get is January of 1918, when that state declares its full independence. It declares its independence when the troops led by the Bolsheviks, by Colonel Muravyov, are on the outskirts of Kiev and are actually shelling the Kiev. So that was the previous time the shelling of the Kiev was taking place. Ukraine declares its independence actually facing the threat of the Bolshevik invasion. So much for Lenin creating Ukraine. And what really happens with the Soviet Union is that Lenin realized, earlier than other Bolshevik leaders, that to take over Ukraine, to halt to Ukraine, you have to actually make some concessions and you have to accommodate Ukrainian national movement. Because without that, control over Ukraine would not last for too long. And his accommodation was creation of the Soviet Union, where at least pro forma Ukraine was recognized equal to Russia. So what is, and I'm finishing with that particular question here, is that Lenin is not creating Ukraine. Lenin, by creating the Soviet Union, for the first time creates Russian Federation with its own borders, with its own institutions, which would be different from the borders and institutions of the empire. So this is the state that eventually Mr. Putin now leads, but he also has very complicated relationship with the founder of that state, as we know. So he certainly attacks Lenin for making those concessions.
Yeah. And one more question. This because you mentioned that the real sense of this denazification, what Putin is speaking, is de facto the Ukrainization, is a extermination of really Ukrainians, etc. But such, let's say, the Ukrainization or some kind of extermination we had in the past, you know, the Holodomor and the politics of Stalin. I understand also it was the main goal of this politics in Turkey, or not?
Well, it may sound maybe a little bit strange, but Stalin's policies, at least pro forma, recognized the existence of Ukrainians as a nation. The policy of Holodomor, if you combine it with attack on the Ukrainian institutions, Academy of Sciences, this separate Orthodox Church, were defined by Raphael Lemkin, the person who coined the term of genocide and developed that concept. It was defined as a genocide. But all of that being said, Stalin never questioned, again, being Georgian himself, never questioned the idea that, okay, Ukrainians existed, that the Ukrainian language existed, and had the right to exist in some form. We see that now the page is turned. So we are back to what General Denikin during the Russian Civil War was saying, and what basically Alexander Solzhenitsyn, a Nobel Prize winner, implied, and he certainly influences Putin very much, that Ukrainians, if they exist, they don't have the right to have a state of their own. Yeah. And eventually they don't have the right to have identity of their own. What that means is that either they are, quote unquote, being denazified or stop being Ukrainians, or they would be killed like it is happening in Mariupol.
Yeah. Well, so we have one more argument, such a legal argument, that the founders of Soviet Union were three republics. Russia, Ukraine, four, and Kazakhstan, yeah?
There was Transcaucasian Federation, a strange creation.
Yeah. Yeah. And then, of course, Ukraine had the status of a member of United Nations as well, and all United Nations agencies and structures. Well, but the last historical question, because that is also misused very often, the question of Crimea and this decision of Soviet leadership, 54, to include Crimea to Ukraine. How to explain it? That's a serious argument, and that is also the part of this propaganda, Putin's propaganda.
Well, Crimea is quite unique in terms of the formation of Ukrainian territory and Ukrainian state, in the sense that that is the only part of Ukraine where the Russians constituted the majority. And it also had another indigenous population, of course, the Crimean Tatars. So it's a complex history. And there were, of course, Greeks and Bulgarians and so on and so forth. Now, most of Ukrainian territory is being formed on the basis of the ethnic principles. So first there was the folklore, and people in the 19th century were going out there and collecting the songs, and then they were trying to figure out what language those people used, and then maps were created of ethnic groups, and then the idea of a state. So one of the definitions of what nationalism is about, coming from Ernst Gellner, is that it's a political principle where the ethnic borders coincide with the state borders. And that was the foundation, how the map of Ukraine as a state was formed. Crimea is an exception. So why was it attached? Well, the explanation there is you look at geography. And 20th century showed that ethnic maps don't actually really function well because the state has to need access to the sea, like it was the case with interwar Poland, or economic basis has to be there. So ethnographic principle is there, but there are adjustments. So Ukraine, again, is not an exception. Why that adjustment was made? Because Crimea is a peninsula. Peninsula in terms of logistics, in terms of providing resources, of everything else, depends on the mainland. We are now in Venice. Look at Venice and where the supplies are coming from, where the tourists are coming from, where the business is coming from. It comes from mainland. You cut off Venice from mainland, and the place would go through a very difficult period of time. That what was happening with the Crimea within the Soviet Union before 1954, Crimea turned out to be economically isolated. It was very difficult for the Russian Federation to deal just logistically, to rebuild the economy after the Second World War, plus the Crimean Tatars were resettled. So by 1954, Crimea was in a very difficult economic situation. And Khrushchev, who came from Ukraine, he offered a solution. So that was his way to get up in the power in Moscow to say, okay, we have problem of Crimea, I'll solve it, I'll go to my former underlings in Ukraine. And he went and he convinced them to take Crimea on. They didn't want that, because in the Soviet system, they were getting economically depressed region. That means that their reporting to Moscow would suffer now, right? So they got a problem in understanding, administrative understanding, bureaucratic understanding in the Soviet Union. But Khrushchev convinced them to do that. And the Crimea was integrated in the economic complex associated with Ukraine, and functioned that way until 2014. Given Ukraine as a basically after World War II as a really condominium, Russian-Ukrainian or Ukrainian-Russian condominium in terms of language and culture, there was no rejection of Ukraine. And Crimea was taken over in a military way. So it wasn't Transnistria, it wasn't Chechnya, it wasn't a local mobilization that would lead to that. It was a military operation. As a result of that, Crimea was taken away from Ukraine. So, but again, the way how it happened, it's a very kind of a almost classic European story where the ethnographic map is the base, and then economics are taken into account as well.
Okay, thank you. Interesting explanation, but additional question. As such accusation is also repeated by Putin, Lavrov, that they are protected, they are obliged to protect Russian-speaking citizens of Donetsk, Lugansk, Crimea, etc. You know the history of Ukraine after independence, 91, very well. These accusations are serious. Ukraine did some mistakes in relation to these Russian-speaking groups. I remember because we, as a YES, we organized first many years our annual meetings in Yalta, Crimea, and I remember that this autonomy was treated by Ukraine very seriously. You know, 2 languages, official languages, even 3 languages, Tatar language as well. All these relations, of course, I observed only from some distance this situation, but I couldn't find some serious accusation against this status of autonomy of Crimea. I'm not so familiar with the situation in Donetsk and Lugansk, but probably would be important to say that it was a problem before all these aggressions and annexations, or that is an artificial problem.
Well, the issues of language and culture, these are one of those issues, identity issues, around which it's relatively easy to mobilize people to do one thing or to do another. But I have no doubt that this is really an invented problem, invented as justification for the aggression. And the closest parallel would be with the German minority in Czechoslovakia. Czechoslovakia turned out to be the only democratic state in Eastern Europe at that time. So, but alleged oppression of the German population was used as a pretext. The same is here. If you go to the Crimea, you look at the Crimea, the number of Ukrainian schools, it seems to me there were 3, maybe less, maybe more, but that's the extent of forceful Ukrainization in the Crimea. So that is a reality check. And when you look at Donetsk and Luhansk and what is happening there, the situation again in terms of the number of schools was better than it was in the Crimea, but again it was an absolute minority. So it is a pretext. It is an invented issue. It is an invented problem, and I'll just give you one more example which is very clear and very obvious. Look at the outflow of the ethnic Russians or Eastern Slavs from the former republics of the Soviet Union. And look at the numbers. Look at Kazakhstan, look at the Baltic states, look at Central Asia. That is the real indication. The Russians will live in the Caucasus and will live in Central Asia. Not just Russians, but also Russian-speaking Ukrainians, and they were living for Russia, they were living for Ukraine. As far as I know, there was no outflow of Russians or significant outflow, either from the Crimea or from eastern parts of Ukraine. So look at that together with the number of the Russian schools. And that is the clearest possible indication. That is right there. You can Google that, you can look at that, and that will provide you the answer to what degree that was a real problem or it was an invented one. Right. If it would be a real one, there would be a strong movement against Ukraine, like, again, the case of Transnistria, or what was happening, for example, in Abkhazia, in Georgia, and so on and so forth. Ukraine had nothing of that. Again, whether there were mistakes, probably there were mistakes. And again, on symbolical level, maybe on maybe other, but again, it doesn't really matter because the problem wasn't invented.
Thank you. Anastasia, before we will start to discuss Holocaust history, I would like to ask you about you and your life. You were born in Ukraine, yes?
Да, я пережила Голокост в 1932-1933 году. Мне было тогда 7 лет.
Yes, I survived Holocaust in 32nd and 33rd year, and I was...
Когда-то в Киеве на одной из передач, телепередач, меня спросили, как вы выжили в голоду в Берген-Бельзене, голодному, такое время пробыть. А я говорю, наверное, я подучилась в 1932-1933 году. Я уже прошла раз эту голодную школу, и это мне помогло.
When once I was on television in Kiev, someone asked me how could you survive the concentration camp, and I said I actually had this school already. I experienced that during hunger in 32nd, 33, so I knew already how to survive. Holodomor, yes.
А голод был страшный, хоть пресса писала, что не урожай, но потом оправдывали, вот не уродило, вот поэтому. Это вранье. Ходили буксирные бригады по домам и с такими шупами и выискивали, не спрятал ли человек какой-то жменьки зерна где-нибудь.
Everyone in media were saying that there just was no harvest that year, but this is a lie, because I remember when soldiers were coming and really seeking for some leftovers of food in our homes.
І скільки не здавали в заготовку, як положено, і все мало, все не мало, шукайте в людей, ще є хліб. І забирали все, що було їстівного в хаті. При мені я сиділа під одною, я розкажу вам.
And even if they found something, at least they still were seeking and trying to look for more, and taking out from our home the last pieces of bread.
Ми з подругою ходили раненько навесні по городам у людей. Не осталось де-небудь прошлогодня картоплинка, чи морквинка, чи щось-небудь їстівне. От походили, нема ніде нічого, один хрін виростає, а куди ж він нас, він Ми сіли під одною хаткою. Хатка була така, ну, типічно, як кажуть, шевченківська хатка. Старення під соломою, не було шибки в вікні, шибка затулена якоюсь виточкою вмісто стекла, навіть фанерки не було забитою. І ми сіли відпочити під цією хаткою.
Early in the morning in spring, I remember I was walking with my friend, and we were walking in the gardens and fields and trying to find at least something, at least some leftovers of a potato in the ground or carrots in the ground. And we couldn't find anything there, just like small radishes. And then we found one house, very small one, Ukrainian, like full national house, and it was completely abandoned, even no windows were there. And we sit there.
І раптом чуємо, входять у двір бригада чоловіків, навірно, чоловік 5, заходять у цю хатку, і тут починається крик, плач жіночий. Ми полякалися, ж діти малі, сидимо, і раптом відкривається оця шибка, що заткнута була виточкою, і падає мішочок якийсь, торбинка із української сорочки, зроблена з рукава. Бух у траву, бур'ян сухий, прошлогодній. Ми думаємо, напевно, золото викинула баба ворочок. Ми до того ворочка, Боже мій, а там фасолька, жменя фасольки. Я як зараз її бачу своїми очима. Довгенька, длинненька, і всередині чорненький рисунок, ми казали янголок. Фасолька з янголком.
And when we were sitting in this house, several soldiers came, and then we heard the scream of one woman, and we were very afraid. And then we saw that something fell out of one of the doors, and we actually saw that someone tried to keep their gold or something. But then we opened this a piece of cloth, and then we saw their beans. And I remember these beans as right now, and I remember this on these beans there was like a pattern with black pattern, and it looked like an angel.
Ми положили той узолок на місто, дождалися, поки ця бригада вийшла, і пішли додому. Так що отакі лишки, отакі ховали від держави, щоб не здати. Забирали останнє, що на вечерю людям осталося, зварить поїсти, і те забирали із шкафів, із горшечків, із тарілочок.
We put these beans back, then we waited till these soldiers went out and also left this house. But I want to say that they were coming and taking the last leftovers of everything that we had, not only bread, not only prepared food, but also anything that they could find.
В результаті чого смертність. Вимирали села сім'ями, хоронить нікому. Якусь підводу виділили, собирати трупи і звозити в могилу вовчу. Ну, одна підвода на все село, а решту сусіди, чоловіки трупа в рядно і тягли через шкільне подвір'я. Ми при школі жили, мій батько вчитель був. І на простки у цю братську могилу. За цією рядниною, в якому тягли трупа, ніхто не йшов, ніхто не плакав, ніхто не голосив, так як мусить бути на похоронах. Нема кому, вся сім'я вимерла.
And as a result, there were so many dead people, and even there were no people who could bring these corpses and dead people into the grave. So I remember there was a really big brotherly grave. I remember then later people were bringing corpses to one of the schools, and I remember as my dad was a teacher, and I remember when people were bringing corpses to this brotherly grave, no one was screaming or crying. There was completely silence because all other people were also dead. There were no people to cry over these dead people.
Займалися пошуками їстівного бур'янця якогось. І от я знаю, був такий бур'янець, називався козелець. Він похожий на алоє. От, стовбур і листочки розходять. І той стовбур їстівний. І ми за ним зранку до ночі лазили по буграм, по канавам, шукали цього козельця, їли, ділилися, хто знайде клєвера, головочку, кашки, то ми розділимося, як шоколадкою, поділилися. І ми на тих козельцях, на цих шав'ях диких, отак, я думаю, і вижили.
We as a kids, as I remember, we were walking everywhere in fields and gardens, and we were trying to find kozelets. This is a plant that looks like aloe, and we figured out that we actually can eat it. So every time we were trying to find a clever, for example, and we were sharing this clever, just like a chocolate right now, to eat. And I think that we actually survived just because of these plants.
Thank you, Anastasia. That is very touching, true story. And probably you are right that you survived, this generation survived, the generation of Ukrainians survived this tragedy of Holocaust because of this previous tragedy of genocide, of Holodomor. Yesterday I said it, and I want to repeat it. For me, when we speak about Putin and war crimes, one of element of this war crime is that this generation of Anastasia, after Holodomor, after World War II, after all these dramatic years after the war, they are confronted now with a new war. The war which is Putin's war against innocent Ukraine and innocent Ukrainians. And that is something what, in my opinion, in moral sense, is really war crime. And I want to move now to Professor Plochy and with such question, identity. I remember my first visits to independent Ukraine, 91, 92, 3. I think my impression was that this identity is not very strong because it's influenced very much by Soviet past, by this problem with what is a native language, etc., etc. But I observed in the next 30 years really strengthening of Ukrainian identity. And even I can say that after 2014, after annexation of Crimea, it was such explosion of especially among young generation, this Ukrainian identity. I think today that is even stronger. But could you tell us how you see this Ukrainian identity now? We have some division line between elder generation and young generation, or not? We have some division lines between the regions, or not? And what means this war, this situation now for the future of Ukraine's sense of identity? Is because I heard such opinion that this new Ukraine is born now. So we have, let's say, this fundament of the new Ukraine because of everything what's happened. And Zelensky is a hero of this new era, of this new epoch, of the new identity of Ukrainians. Is true, or maybe it's too much to say so? Please.
First of all, thanks for this memories about the Holodomor in particular, because I was like in the presence of my own grandma retelling all these stories. So it is personal, and it is personal for probably the majority of Ukrainians today in different generations. But I was also thinking that I kind of was getting a better appreciation for what was going on there, now living through the current developments and events. And it seems to me it's what is happening today, this tragedy sheds a new light also on Ukrainian experience and Ukrainian history in the 20th century. And this is the experience of wars, of tragedy, but also of the survival. And survival of people, but also survival of identity. And there is a transformation of identity. There is no question about that. 1991, in December of 1991, Ukraine was the only Soviet republic that had a referendum on independence.
Unexpected result.
Yes, the only republic. More than 92%, including the majority in the Crimea, over 80% in Donbass, voted for independence, deciding the fate not only of Ukraine, but also of Russia, Kazakhstan, and a number of other republics. So that gives you some idea about the presence of that identity, despite the fact that in 1990 and 91 you go to, especially in Ukraine's east or in Ukraine's south, like today, modern today, people speak Russian. You don't see this kind of obvious elements or markers of separate nation. But that vote tells you that idea was there. But there is a huge difference, big difference, between 1991 and 2014, and then 2022. Because what happened in 1991 was that the choice was, okay, to go and to vote. And the Soviet Union was collapsing. Ukraine was economically doing better than Russia, especially in the big cities, being agrarian, having a good agrarian base. So the vote was partially political, partially cultural, very much economic. People were voting also for a better economic future. And the price of that was actually to wake up, to go to the polling box and put the ballot. The price of that choice, whatever went into that, economy, politics, and other things, in 2014 was already very different. Voting for independence in 2014 was very often actually taking economic sacrifice. Given that economy of Ukraine was not doing, again, because oil, gas, and other issues was actually doing worse than Russian economy. The pensions were high in Russia and so on and so forth. So economy was not anymore the factor, or at least the driving factor. And the price was much higher. It was not going to polls anymore. It was risking your life. And in parts of Ukraine, the Russian invasion worked. In others, it didn't work, and people united. Again, across linguistic lines, across ethnic lines, and we know that it wasn't for the sake of economy, per se. And by 2022, we see a new quality. The new quality of that identity and really relation between the people and the authorities, relation between the people and institutions. The major problem historically in Ukraine was the issue of relationship between people and the state, because the state traditionally was foreign. The state was bringing Holodomor, another state was bringing Holocaust. So all the states were coming from somewhere else. And in Ukraine, the distrust of the state and state authorities was always extremely high. Now look at what is happening today in terms of the position of the government, in terms of the relationship between government and people, the mayors, the elected officials, why in areas around Kyiv, why it is in the south that the representatives of the mayors, the heads of the councils, they're hunted first. There is this term kidnapping, which I consider completely inappropriate. It is just arrest by the occupying authorities of the legitimate leadership of the regions and of the oblasts. And people were there marching in their defense. So that is a new quality of Ukrainian identity in which the state is not perceived anymore as someone who came to rob you of your life, to rob you of your possessions, to rob you of your future. This is our state now. And that's a dramatic change compared when you look at Ukraine's history since the times almost immemorial. So it is a new nation which learns how to survive not outside of the state, not in opposition to the state, but using the state as an instrument for survival. And this is something that when you look about, when the question was also about the future, I think that once that skill is acquired, it's very difficult to take the skill away. So Ukraine as a state nation is fully born really now in this warfare.
I fully agree. So I think we can observe this birth of new Ukraine, and I think this strong identity will be extremely important factor after the war for reconstruction, for development, for westernization, such final of westernization of Ukraine. I think that can be decisive element, like in Poland after the war or in Germany after the war as well. You know, defeated Germany decided to use all these possible efforts to go forward.
Yes, it's a paradox and sad paradox in a sense that yes, wars destroy people, but wars also help to forge that very strong national identity.
It is paradox, but it's true. Well, so now I propose the last topic of our discussion. At the very beginning it was a main idea, but I tried to use especially the presence of Professor Plochy to explain all this historical background for our viewers. And now I want to go back to Anastasia with such question. We know very well the slogan, "Never Again." During my time in school, in universities, we participated in many events, anniversaries connected with the war, with the Holocaust, and it was a main slogan, main sentence, "Nigdy więcej," never again. But we see, unfortunately, that of course, we agree that such tragedy as Holocaust cannot be repeated, but we see that it was repeated, not only in European scale, but in the world. We know what happened in Yugoslavia, we know what happened in Rwanda, and now, in the 21st century, we have Mariupol, we have Bucha, we have Irpin, we have a lot of such places when we can speak, maybe not about Holocaust, because I don't want to discuss what means Holocaust and if Holocaust is only connected with the extermination of Jews or not, but genocide for sure. We have a genocide. Here we cannot have some doubts, and that is exactly genocide like Lemkin defined it in his works. So, quick question to you, Anastasia. Why the people are ready, not all people, but some of leaders, some of people, they are ready to organize such new genocide, new Holocaust, again and again. What is wrong? Why is possible? Теперь Holocaust.
Всякое насилие над человеком получается от того, что прощаются людям, которые занимаются убийствами, всякими подвохами, им что-то прощается.
Every kind of violence that one human being can make to another human being, it's happening because those who are making violence to another person, they are forgiven some way, forgiven.
Не наказан Путин за то, что уничтожил польское правительство под Смоленском. Ну, всем же видно было, что авария сделана умышленная, искусственная.
Putin
Простили Боинг 777, который Путин сбил над Украиной, погибло 300 человек. Простили, что там монтировали и пришли к выводу, что оно действительно из, як называется это орудие? Из Бука. И видели, как Бук тянули из России, притянули, и рассчитали, что вот он стрельнул в этот бок, и в это крыло, в это. Все факты были видны, раскрыты. Ну, а вывод какой? Ждут, умрут свидетели, пройдет, забудет люди. Бескаранность. Бескаранность Сирия прошла. И так идет, и накопился этот каторжанин, уже пришел в такую уверенность, что против него нет никаких возражений. Делай, что хочешь.
So the problem, why is that happening again, is because everything that Putin did, he was forgiven for that. He wasn't punished for that. This plane that was a shell crashed near Smolensk, for example, this Boeing. There are so many evidences with this Russian missiles book. Everybody saw this evidence that they were bringing it from Russia, and then this Boeing with just civilians were crashed. But just everybody's forgiving Putin and not punishing him. So he starts to feel that he cannot do more violence to other people. That's why it's happening.
Yes, I think that is a very important point underlined by Anastasia, that all this crime must be punished if we don't want to, let's say, accelerate such situation or create more and more such situation. Professor, what is your opinion? Why why this slogan "Never Again" is so weak? Why we are repeating such the worst things like genocide? What is wrong politically, or maybe the education is wrong? What is your insight?
Well, again, another great question, and I agree with what Anastasia was saying. Again, another term for that is just lack of justice, international justice. Another term for that is also appeasement. And I personally, as a historian, really believed until maybe 2014 that we as a society can draw lessons from what happened. Things like appeasement, things like aggression, and that there is no way back. And I was wrong. Again, I was in good company to be wrong. Again, many people, it looks like, shared the same kind of illusion, but it turned out to be illusion. And history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. And it rhymes in a sense that you have a Great Depression of the late 20s, early 30s, and rise of populism and fascism and authoritarian regimes, and you have a recession, Great Recession now, and you have this complete change of the political landscape.
Yes.
And what that means, at least lesson for me, is that history can rhyme. These extreme situations can repeat. The leaders and the population at large can behave in the same way, and we have to be prepared for that. We, as intellectuals, we as politicians, we as society,
citizens,
citizens, and have instruments to deal with that, because that will be coming again. We know that for sure. That wasn't just one time.
But Professor, I think this is important to say. We are in Italy, and you know that Italy had some special sentiment to Russia. And I know people here, and not only in Italy, but in many Western countries, that okay, this war will be finished one day with better or worse peace agreement or peace treaty, and then we will start to make business as usual with Russia. And even if Putin will stay as a leader of this country. In my opinion, that is wrong. That is something as a lack of justice, what you said. What is your recipe? What is your concept? What should be, even if we'll have some kind of peace agreement, we'll have still the people responsible for this genocide, responsible for this aggression. What we should do? I think we cannot withdraw the sanctions. We should punish Russia and Russian leadership as long as possible. What is your opinion, though?
We had situations with genocide in Europe before, with the Balkan Wars. We had situations certainly in Iraq and in other places with the leaders and authoritarian leaders either just ordering those things or being complicit in one way or another. And the formulas are there, the Hague is there, and so on and so forth. What we face here, which is basically we didn't face before, is that we are dealing with the not just nuclear-armed country, but this is the number of the nuclear warheads is probably the largest in the world. We deal with the country which is member of the Security Council in the United Nations, which with veto right, the organization that has been created with the Orwell's idea that some people are more equal than others, and that this is good, and this is good for the humankind, and that is unprecedented situation. So we kind of have a formula, good or bad, but in principle, how to deal with the non-nuclear countries. But we live in the nuclear age, and this is a big question. But this is question in terms of the politics and political justice. This is not the question of you being able to do business as usual and actually profit from economic interactions with the criminal country or criminal regime. So this is very different, and it's black and white, and it's very clear, and that those things shouldn't happen. The politics and military relations, again, that's something that we still have to figure out how to deal with that.
So, thank you very much. I don't know how for you and for our viewers this discussion was interesting, but for me it was interesting. Thank you very much, Anastasia Gulin and Professor Plochy. I think it's not time to summarize all the very interesting insights, but I tell you, I have no doubts. This new era, new epoch started 24th of February, and nothing will be the same as before. And it's necessary to understand as well that this drama of Russian aggression against Ukraine is very much connected with the also unexpected drama before the COVID and the pandemic. The mankind wasn't prepared for such a pandemic. And after that we have a new political pandemic, what is Putin and his politics. And I think today is necessary to support Ukraine as much as possible politically with united voice of European Union, NATO, and all of us, civil societies in these countries, militarily with supplies of modern equipment, and what is important, that Ukrainians know very well how to use it. That is not, they are not wasted supplies. That is something what is using very correctly, effectively in the hands of Ukrainian soldiers. It's necessary to continue very, very tough sanctions against this crime regime in Kremlin. And after that, it's necessary to remember, because I think this lesson of this drama, of this tragedy, of this genocide, and we participate even as observers only, but we participate in this drama, is necessary to remember that if we want to not to repeat this tragic experience, it's necessary to use this justice to punish the criminals and to support Ukraine and Ukrainians in the reconstruction of this beautiful country. So thank you very much for your attention. Slava Ukraine, and I hope next year we will have chance to discuss in more optimistic and in better atmosphere as today. But everything what Ukraine is doing now is unbelievable, including this pavilion. Thank you.
Thank you. Something that looks like a very simple question. What does war mean for you? And whether your understanding of war changed in February of this year or not, it's basically the same. So what happened with the concept of war to you in the last few months?
I was working, thank you for this question. I was working in the war zone as a photographer and artist in 2014. I was traveling to Donbass and I was in Debaltseve under shellings. When the shellings were scheduled, they should start at 5 o'clock. Mm-hmm. And people were trying to go out from these small shelters in their houses just to see some light of the day, maybe to take some products. And they saw me. I was coming from Kiev, and they asked me, where are you from? And I said, Kiev, and they were very afraid. They said, Kiev maybe is, we don't know who, but maybe Kiev is now destroying our city, destroying our lives. We are watching Russian TV, and at that moment, I knew that lots of people in Ukraine and people in Kiev were also like were also influenced by Russia propaganda and thinking that these people are actually against Kiev. But in my view, they were just in the situation of war, and it wasn't important what they are saying. The most important was really to save them from this awful situation. And then in the safety, their mind maybe would change. And my whole idea of my work at that time was trying to understand what war is doing to everyday life. My whole research, interviews, photographs I was making. And I discovered that small cities in Donbass that prevented everyday life, where people were going to work, mines proceed working. When the Ukrainian army came and the cities were freed from Russian occupation, actually war was really not happening there. So they were not destroyed, and people could prevent values of different kind of life. And now these people were really good citizens of Ukraine till Russian aggression not came again. Now when the war started, I couldn't believe that now I am somebody I was actually interviewing at that time, that I'm an object of this research. And my work is actually turning this research view to myself, to understand what war is doing to everyday life of somebody. And I think that the main question is to prevent these values of not war epoch, of not war era, to protect everyday life values where the world is not only divided into black and white. Of course, sometimes it is, but it has so many colors and it has so many shades and many different approaches and realities are coexisting. And I would ask you a question. What do you think Ukrainian society would be able to remain such a complex society with such different tradition, practices, languages, ways of thinking, or the war will make it more like will destroy some shades, some forms of life.
Well, first of all, thank you for this answer. And one thing that I learned from it, my question was whether February of 2022 changed to you anything, and whether that's the start of the war. And your answer suggested that actually the war started for you back in 2014, and this is part of the story that is probably not completely unknown, but is not really registered well outside of Ukraine, that the war has been going for so long, but there is also a change. And again, I think it's a very interesting, this idea that war turns things into black and white, and that the nuances disappear, and that the everyday routine of life that we take for granted also just goes somewhere. Again, it's really very interesting. And in light of what you said, I'm now thinking about your question. What will happen with the Ukrainian society? Well, we know for sure what already happened in 2014. And what happened in 2014 was that society emerged to be much more unified. And for me, looking at that from the perspective of a historian, I look at the map of Ukrainian elections, presidential elections, before 2014 and after 2014. And before that, Ukraine, there were at least two Ukraines, they were clearly divided. There was geographic boundaries. And that division disappeared after 2014. So whether it's the elections of Poroshenko, elections of Zelensky, again, they're different candidates with different platforms, but it didn't matter in the sense that the pattern on the map pre-2014 didn't repeat itself. There was a level of unity that wasn't there before. And I think that that's what the current war is already bringing. This is something that will continue. The level of the unity and solidarity and more agreement on the basics, understanding of the purpose, and also value to the institutions and state institutions in particular. So I'm pretty sure that that's exactly what will happen. In terms of the shades and nuances, I think that eventually the war takes away those things, and I think that will be a challenge. That will be a challenge. Again, I think that maybe you're in the best position here to think about how, if this is the real tendency, how far it can go, given that you lived through this period between 2014 and 2022, right? You know what happened. So I think that whatever happened would have its continuation. Maybe it will be more accentuated. But the war changes people. The wars change societies, and I think that Ukrainian society will emerge much more mature for itself and much more unified. I really don't see the immediate threat of disappearance of this kind of multicolor pallitra that is out there, at least if the war is not lasting forever, if it doesn't turn into a sort of a war state and the war that continues indefinitely. So I think I'm quite optimistic there. But again, I also have no doubt that there will be an impact. There is much more black and white today, and that will continue.
I would love to ask you, how do you imagine, how do you think or see the finale of this war?
Well, the finale of the war will be certainly a temporary agreement. It will be a ceasefire, whatever name is being attached to it. And it will leave a lot of unresolved issues with which Ukraine will have to struggle. The territories that will remain outside of Ukraine, and it looks like some of them will remain at this point, will have their own challenges. So I envision it, there are these comparisons of this war with World War II to a degree, in the way how it is fought. Certainly, it's the most, in terms of its scope, the number of people, the number of arms, the number of refugees, people who find themselves homeless, being killed and wounded. There is no real parallel besides World War II. So it will be a difficult piece. It will be a difficult piece, but also I think that there will be foundations for this new unity and for new nation. And the nation that united itself in defense of really democracy and institutions, right? Because Donbass showed, in particular Donbass showed very well what Ukraine had and didn't want to lose. Not just in economic terms, but in cultural terms, in terms of participation in your life, in terms of freedom, in terms of elements of democracy. And I think that there will be the Ukrainian society will solidify itself around those issues. The question that I have is, what will happen and what is already happening with art, right, with literature. Because on the one hand, again, I have at home this album of the World War II propaganda posters coming from different places, and they're very similar to a degree. A dehumanization of the enemy and valor of your side. So there is a saying that truth is the first victim of the war. So you can't talk about certain things. There is censorship. You don't want to talk about certain things, and there is a demand for you to talk about particular other issues. So what does it do to writer? What does it do to poet? What does it do to artist? There are demands coming from outside, but there are demands coming from inside.
It's a very interesting question, and I am thinking a lot about it. I think that war actually destroys languages and partly destroys history. And I'm looking at war as some kind of a childhood of society, because if you see how Europe is thinking about Second World War, it's like it's a place in time where everything is beginning, new strategies, new values, new idea who we are, how the world can be changed, in which direction. It is always the Second World War which brings a particular image of what we also don't want to have in our life. What is fascism and what is totalitarianism. So war destroys plans, and I was working, beginning my new book and photographic project when the war started, and I interrupted everything. I couldn't proceed. My language that was born in the moment when this project emerged in my head, it stopped. It stopped from happening, from being possible. And I understood that if I can write at all, I can write only about my surroundings, document what is happening around me. I was not seeing this documentation as an artwork at that moment. and I was using the language I never used. I was writing in German. Of course, I might have written some small texts, commentaries, lots of letters, but I never used German strategically as a main language to create something. So I think war is actually stopping art from happening. It is making it absolutely impossible. And what we are seeing here in Ukrainian Pavilion, it is how art as a language is documenting biography of an artist in different forms. We see it in a sculptural, in installation of Nikita Kadan, in big paintings of Lesya Kamenka. Maybe
so it is documentation. I'm getting this right or not? You're kind of recording. You're bearing a testimony to what is happening around you.
Witnessing, practically.
Right, but you're saying that this is not art.
I'm not saying that it is not art. I'm saying that the language of art is actually concentrated to be on the idea fixed to be a document. But this document, because it consists of this language, can later be considered as an artwork. When I started to write my diary, I wasn't thinking it can be or it might be an artwork. But the time passed by, and now I think it can also be read like this. And of course, works of Nikita Kadan, Lesya Kamenka are different, but I think that what war is doing, we are not speaking that war is actually also moving art into the direction of propaganda and making art really create some protective forms, protective images. As you said, dehumanization of an enemy and the concept of who we are, why we are better, why we should win. If you are not looking in that direction and thinking about what complex, interesting, and really unique Ukrainian art can do today, I think it's always connected, as I heard from a great project that my friends are developing, that is always connected to just preserve some pieces of reality that it's developing right now. It is disconnected from the time before war on different levels.
You said Ukrainian art. What war means for Ukrainian art now in general? So on the one hand, there is a clearer way how you provide this delimitation, right, of the territory, of the space, either emotional or otherwise. So it is Ukraine under attack, and you are part of Ukraine. So where Ukrainian starts, where Ukrainian ends, where international or global starts, because again, war is global. And this is also the set of languages that you can talk to others. But it also limits the number of others that you can talk to, because part of those others are aggressor, are enemies. So where the Ukrainian art is in all this story, what does the war does to it, or does to basically what you are doing?
I think it's about being with some society and witnessing what is happening to the society and interpreting yourself as a part of this society. Because, of course, today, in today's situation, the language of art is becoming international. And we cannot think about heritage or about art only in national borders. It is even the history of art.
But we are forced to think about that in those borders, right? Because you are attacked, we are attacked because you are associated with Ukraine, right?
That is a part of the violence of the war. To be forced to think again in the national borders, it is part of the violence of this war also.
Right. And what that violence does, it pushes you to break these borders or embrace them and defend them.
I think that's a very tricky question, but I think that Ukrainian art was always concentrated and deeply involved into the local context, not only artistic but also social context. It is something that describes the art I was always inspired by and interested in, art from Ukraine. And this kind of artistic language is just, even at this moment, even much more looking around itself. And by seeing what is happening around an artist from Ukraine, by watching it and making out of this view an artwork, it actually preserves for the future the reality of today's reality. And this reality is a reality we all one day don't want really to remember. We will, of course, remember it, and we will mythologize it like it always happened, and it will be maybe a special time we are referring to, but to remember the time itself, what we were experiencing, I think some very clearly and very thought through done objects of art and literature and will help us just will help us not really to forget.
You mentioned languages, that the war destroys languages. I assume it also helps to other languages to be born, right? We still communicate. Maybe at the time of the war we communicate now not in metaphorical languages but in more real languages more than we did before. Your diary was in German. Our conversation is now taking place in English. I assume your native language is Ukrainian or Russian or both. What happens especially to the writer, to the person who uses the language when you use other language than your native? How authentic you are, and to what degree you also switch into language, you also certainly switch in audience. Is this something that is important, or this is, or okay, we just change languages, but basically what we want to say is more or less the same. We just maybe using different grammar structures. Or it changes also something about what we are saying.
I'm sure it changes actually a bit, only a bit. And it's because language is very much connected to different audiences. And German language was chosen because I was invited by German newspaper to write, and it was much quicker to write in German than to be translated. And I was also speaking to this different audience, not to people who were experiencing war near me, but to somebody who might be in kind of a bit different situation. Not radically different, because I think it's really a war that is happening with the whole Europe, but a bit different. And also, it was directed to somebody who might influence, in my view, the situation. Like now we are waiting that German will deliver some heavy weapons that we need just to protect ourselves, basically. So the idea that I'm speaking to somewhere else outside of this, outside of непосредственный, безпосередний, immediate conflict, immediate pain, this idea was bringing me power to write at all. About my writing languages, Russian and Ukrainian, and I was even more writing in Russian, but also in Ukrainian. That's an interesting question, what will change? What will change and how they will change, and what I will be able to say in each of them.
Well, thank you. I'm also thinking that the diary would be very different if it would be, let's say, letters to, let's say, a relative or a neighbor who just left Kiev and wants to know what is happening there. The topics would be different, things that you explain or don't have to explain. There is no need to explain, otherwise you sound artificial and necessary. So that the audience really changes a lot, and language changes as well. You asked me about peace, right, and how it will look like. And it's difficult to answer this question. We don't know. We didn't expect the war would last for so long. We didn't expect that many things, and some things surprised us and some positively surprised us, not only negative. But did you think about something that you want to write once the war is over, which would not be war?
I'm starting actually to think about that. I'm starting, and I think it's a good sign. And yeah, and are you planning? Are you seeing? Because when you were answering one of my questions, you said if the war would become permanent, and I wanted immediately to ask you, as a historian, as a person who analyzes war and how it started, do you think there is such a pessimistic possibility to be discussed at all? And do you think that our society will be able also to stop fighting if this possibility will occur, to stop fighting?
Well, we started our discussion from the day when the war started, and you went not to 22 but to 2014. So Ukraine has lived in the state of undeclared, unstopped war for 8 years, and from that point of view, it's relatively easy to imagine some state of that kind of continuation. I want to think that this will not happen. We have also the states that are in a permanent wartime tension, for example, Israel. So these things happen. But I think that there will be some period of this really between Cold War and no war, no peace situation before it stabilizes. So I want to be optimistic, but I think that we should be prepared for continuation of a very tense relationship with our aggressor after the aggressor is stopped and hopefully pushed back from a number of our territories. And this also doesn't sound so unrealistic, given that we already know what happened around Kiev. So these things are quite realistic, that they can happen as well. We should be really very not too maybe constrained by certain fears in terms of thinking how the war can end, and what our victory as a society can be. But that victory will bring also a period of tension. So I hope I'm wrong. But given the immediate experience, given what we certainly hear happening in Russia and coming from Russia, we should be ready. We should be prepared for a long haul, not of that kind of war, long haul of some form of confrontation. And then, if it doesn't happen, well, that would be fantastic. That would be great. But to really be able to celebrate that at that moment, you have to be prepared for longer confrontation.
Thank you very much.
Well, thank you.